So in the last video in our Tycoon, we set up the Tycoon builds, the leader stats, we created the buttons, and we also assigned a Tycoon when you join the game. What we've now got to do is work on coding the buttons so they actually unlock the items. We'll set up their billboards. We'll also set up the positioning of items and cloning them out of the replicated storage to put them down. And then we'll finish off by saving our Tycoon. So now that we've assigned a Tycoon to a player, we can code the buttons. So let's go into our main script in the Explorer window and select it. And then back in the code editor, I'm just going to hide this yellow banner. Let's just zoom out. We've only got one function at the moment, which is to assign our Tycoon. But we're going to create a few more functions in this video. Let's start off by creating a function which will take a player and return their Tycoon. So local function get Tycoon. We'll just increase the size here for you. So get Tycoon. We're going to take the player as an argument. And then what we'll do is we'll loop through all of the Tycoons in the workspace. So for underscore, comma, Tycoon in game.workspace.tycoons, because don't forget in the Explorer window, under the workspace, we have our Tycoons folder. So we'll say game.workspace.tycoons : get children. Do, and then inside of here we want to say if Tycoon : get attribute, and we want user ID. So if the user ID attribute is equal to the player's user ID, then we will return the Tycoon. Now if the Tycoon does not exist, then this function isn't going to return anything, and we'll be able to take what is returned from this function, so it will be the Tycoon that the player owns, and then we'll be able to change it and reference it. This is just a really quick way of being able to get a specific player's Tycoon, and we'll be using it later on. Right, now let's set up our buttons. So if we just head out of this script and head to one of our Tycoons here, let's just go into the buttons folder and select a button. And if we have a look in the properties window, we're going to need to add an attribute for this button, because we need to know whether it's unlocked. Now, a button will either have a true or false attribute called unlocked, and when you step on the button, we'll set it to be true, and then we'll make the button disappear. So let's set up a Boolean attribute, and we'll just call it unlocked. And click on save. And now what I'm going to do is, because we've already gotten a few more Tycoons over here, I'm just going to destroy them for now. So we've only got this one Tycoon to work with, because we're going to be making a few changes to our Tycoon model here. And as this is going to be the default Tycoon, we'll clone them out later on. So we'll just have one Tycoon for now. And like I've said, we've set up that attribute for our button here called unlocked. We'll just leave it unchecked. What we're also going to do is we're going to give this button a tag. And we're going to use something called the collection service. A collection service is a way of giving a tag to a load of objects, and then you can write code which will apply to all of them, so you don't have to rewrite the same code out over and over again. Now you're going to need a plugin for this called the tag editor. Roblox have added their own tag editor, but I find using the tag editor plugin way more useful. So in the toolbox over here, let me just zoom in. Here we are. If we go to models and select plugins, you'll be able to search for tag editor. And then you want to take this one by @sweetheartedchoke. I'll leave a link in the description. Just make sure that you've installed it. Once you have, go to the plugins window up here, and you will see the tag window underneath instance tagging. So open up the window, and that should open up over here by the Explorer, our tag editor. So what you want to do is you want to select your button, make sure it's selected, and we're going to add a new tag, type in button, and press enter. Then you want to click on the checkbox and make sure that it's checked. Now, if you have any other Tycoons or buttons, make sure you've selected them as well and you've given them this tag. This now means that our button here has got the button tag, and any code that we write for the button tag will be applied to our button here. So if we just head back, you can close the tag editor now. That's all been done, and we head back to our script. We can now write some code which will loop through every single button that's in existence in the game. So we can say for underscore, comma, button in collection service colon get tagged, and then in these brackets we're going to put button do. So this is going to return a table of all of the buttons in every Tycoon in the game. Now we just need to define the collection service. So at the top of our script we'll say local collection service equals game colon get service collection service. That now means we can use the get tagged function, which will get all of our buttons for us. Then for every single button, we want to detect when it's been stepped on. So we can say button dot touched colon connect function, and then we're going to have an argument for hit. Hit is going to be the object that touches our button. It could be a body part of a player, it could be any other part. So we'll need to actually check to make sure that a player has touched this part, and we can do that by creating a variable and calling it player, and we'll just return the result of game.players colon get player from character, and then in these brackets we're going to say hit.parent. Now if a player has touched this brick, then this player variable will be equal to something, but if it isn't, it will just be nil. So we can detect this by saying if not player then return end, and that's just going to end this function here. It's not going to go any further. However, if it is a player, then we want to get their Tycoon, and we've just created a function to do this. So we can get the Tycoon as a variable by saying local Tycoon equals get Tycoon, and we can pass our player from this variable here. And this should return the model of the Tycoon to this variable here. So now that we've got the player's Tycoon, we want to make sure that this button actually exists in their Tycoon, because we don't want them to be stepping on a button for someone else. So we can say if not button colon is descendant of Tycoon, then return end. All that this if statement's doing is it's checking to see if the button that the player stepped on is inside of the player's Tycoon object. So if it's inside of the player's Tycoon object, that's fine. But if it isn't, then we don't want to go any further, because we don't want other players to be stepping on our buttons. The other thing we want to do is we want to make sure that the player does not step on a button that they've already unlocked. So when a player steps on a button, what we're going to do is we're going to make it invisible. We're not going to delete it, we're just going to make it invisible. So we're going to say button.transparency equals 1, button.billboard GUI, because don't forget there's a billboard GUI stored within our button. So, and that's going to have the text of the item. So button.billboard GUI.enabled equals false. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set the unlocked attribute, which we just created, which is all the way down here, this unlocked property, or attribute, sorry. We're going to set that to be true, because the player will have unlocked the item. So we'll say button colon set attribute unlocked comma true. And then what we can do at the very top of our function here is we just want to check to see if the button has already been unlocked, because if it's going to be transparent, it can in theory still be touched. So we don't want to unlock the same item twice if it's already been unlocked. So we can say if button colon get attribute unlocked, then return end. That's just going to prevent the function from going any further. And we don't need to say equals equals true, because button colon get attribute unlocked will be true, okay, if by default. We don't need to check its value. So that will just check to see if the button has already been unlocked. And then the last thing we need to do in this function is we actually need to unlock the item, right? We need to give the player what they've bought, because at the moment, all we're doing is making the button disappear. So that's what we're going to do now. So let's create another function up here, and we're going to call it local function unlock item. And we're going to need to take a few arguments here. We're going to need the player, and we're also going to need the ID of the item. So we'll create two arguments called player and item ID. Now, firstly, let's get the Tycoon of the player. So local Tycoon equals get Tycoon player, and just a quick check to make sure it exists. If not Tycoon, then return end. We can also put the same thing down here. If not Tycoon, then return end, just as a safety mechanism to make sure our script doesn't throw an error. So now we've got the Tycoon, we want to create a clone of the item. So we need to firstly get the item from its ID, because like we said in the last video, we are controlling our items through an ID-based system rather than objects. We're storing them as IDs, so we need to actually find the corresponding object to that ID. So we need to create a variable for our item, and we actually need to create another function to get an item from an ID. So let's do that now. Let's create another function, and we're going to call it getItem. So local, in fact, let's put it all the way up here. Let's put it above our assigned Tycoon. Doesn't really matter, but just for organization, local function getItem, and it's going to take the item ID. That's what we're going to pass to this function. So let's firstly create a variable for our items folder, because we've got an items folder in the replicated storage, which we're going to loop through. So we're going to say at the top here, just by our Tycoon's variable, local items equals, let's create a variable as well for replicated storage. Local replicated storage equals game, get service, replicated storage. And items equals replicated storage, wait for child, items. And just for consistency, I'm going to change the Tycoons from speech marks to these apostrophes here. So now we've got our items and Tycoons variables. Back in our getItem function, we're going to create a for loop, which loops through every single item in our items folder in the replicated storage, and we're going to check to see if that item's ID attribute is equal to the one that we are looking for, and if it is, we'll return it from our function. So local function getItem takes the item ID. We're going to say for underscore comma item in items get children, which is just going to return a list of all the items. Do we say if item get attribute ID equals item ID, then return item. And that's just going to return the correct item for us. Also, in our assigned Tycoon here, we don't necessarily need this return nil, as it will return nil anyway, so you can remove it if you'd like. So now we have a way of getting our item. We can then, in our unlock item function, we can say getItem, and we can pass the item ID, and then we can call clone on it to create a duplicate of that item from the replicated storage. We also want to get the cost of the item. So let's just create a variable for the cost, and because we know that we've stored the cost of every single item as an attribute, which is what we did in the last video, we can just say item get attribute cost. Now we need to check to see if the player can afford this item. So we're going to say if player.leaderstats.cash.value is less than the cost, then return false. That is going to stop the script right there and end it, and just it's going to return. I'm not going to go any further because obviously the player can't afford the item. However, if they can afford the item, let's deduct the cost from their current balance by saying player.leaderstats.cash.value minus equals cost. That is going to subtract it from their current balance. And finally, what we need to do is we need to take our cloned item and we need to position it in the right place. Because at the moment, in our Tycoon, we've got everything laid out in the correct location, but we're going to have lots of different Tycoons. Some Tycoons may be rotated differently, positioned differently. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to basically get the relative position of each item relative to the Tycoon, and then position it relative to where our Tycoon is placed. Because like I've said, some Tycoons might be opposite each other, rotated. So we're going to need to position the item relative to where it currently is. So that's what I'm going to talk you through now. Firstly, however, let's just take our item and parent it to the player's Tycoon. So we'll say item.parent equals Tycoon.items. that's going to put it into the folder that we created in the last video called items. And now what we're going to want to do is we want to get the C frame. We want to set the item C frame. So we'll say item pivot to, and we need to put a C frame in here. So a C frame is a combination of a position and an orientation. So it's an area in the map. We can tell the script where we want to position this item. So we need to give it a C frame. So firstly, we're going to need to have a relative C frame. Now a relative C frame is a position and orientation relative to another part. And in this case, we want to get the conveyors or the item, whichever item it is, we want to get its position relative to our Tycoon. So how are we going to do that? Well, let's create a function which will get a relative C frame. So we're just going to create a local function, get relative C frame, and we're going to take the item ID. Now, do you remember earlier in the last video, I said we're going to position everything where it's going to be in our Tycoon. And then when we start the game up, we're going to strip out all of the items, right? Because the player won't have unlocked them yet, but we have a copy of them in replicated storage, right? Well, because we have got a copy in replicated storage with the position and the orientation saved, we have the position that we want our items to be in. All we now need to do is make them relative to our Tycoon plot, so that if the Tycoon plot is in a different location to where the items are currently placed, they will move with that Tycoon. So what we'll do is we'll find the item that we're looking for with this ID in the player's Tycoon plot. So let's create a variable for the item, and let's create another function which is going to get the item in the Tycoon by its ID. So up here again in the top of the script, we're going to create another function and call it getItemInTycoon by ID. We're going to provide the item ID, and we're also going to provide an object for our Tycoon, which will pass into this function. So we want to loop through all of the items currently in this Tycoon. Actually, what we'll do instead is we'll take our Tycoon here, and we're going to right click and copy it. We'll make a copy of this Tycoon, and we're just going to put it into replicated storage. Okay, so we've created a copy of the Tycoon. This will be our placeholder Tycoon. Let's create a variable for this as well. So local placeholder Tycoon equals replicated storage, wait for child, Tycoon. Okay, so if you ever make any changes to your Tycoon and you add any new items, all you're going to do is right click on it, copy it, and replace it in the replicated storage here. So we have a default Tycoon that will be our placeholder one. Okay, now what we can do is, instead of saying Tycoon here, we'll just loop through our placeholder Tycoon until we find the item that we're looking for. So for underscore comma item in placeholder Tycoon.items get children, we want to make sure it's the correct item. So if item get attribute ID equals item ID, then return item. So what we're doing here in this function is we're getting an item by an ID from the placeholder Tycoon, because in the placeholder Tycoon it's going to be in the correct location where we've set it up to be. Okay, so we're just getting this item, and then what we're going to do is we're going to get the C frame of that item relative to the placeholder Tycoon. So back down here in our get relative C frame script, we now have a path to get our item. So we can say get item in Tycoon by ID, item ID. And now we can get our relative C frame. So local relative CF, which is just a C frame relative to another location. So by default in Roblox, any C frame or position is relative to the origin, which is a point in the world marked by 0, 0, 0. So if you had a part in your game and you have a look at its position down here in the properties, you can see its position is 88, 0.5, 55. That's also its C frame. And that just means it's 88 studs on the x-axis away from 0, 0.5 studs away from 0 on the y-axis, and 55 studs away from 0 on the z-axis. And if I was to move this closer and closer and closer in each direction to the origin, we would eventually get to 0, 0, 0, which if you want, I can set to right now. And if we press F, it's now positioned in the center of the world. So all that we're doing is we are setting the origin of the world to be our Tycoon. So then we know how far away each individual object's going to be. We've got a C-frame or position relative to the center of our Tycoon. So that when we create, if the player is in a different Tycoon, which is positioned away from here or rotated away from here, because we've got a relative C-frame, it doesn't matter how it's rotated, how it's positioned, these items and buttons are always going to be positioned relative to where the Tycoon is. Now don't worry if you can't get your head around this just yet, it is quite complicated, but obviously you're going to need it for our Tycoon. So to get our relative C-frame, all we're going to say is placeholder Tycoon.primaryPart.C-frame : to object space with a lowercase t and an uppercase O and S for object and space. We're just going to say item : get pivot. That's going to get the C-frame of the item, and then this function is going to generate a C-frame which is relative to the primary part of the placeholder Tycoon. So we can now return this relative C-frame, and then back to where we call this function, well, get relative C-frame, we're going to call it in our unlock item down here, where we've got our item : pivot to, we're going to firstly get our relative C-frame. So we'll create a variable for that, relative CF equals get relative C-frame item ID. So just to recap, this is going to get the relative C-frame between, well, so it's going to get the C-frame of the item relative to the Tycoon. Okay, so it could be something, so that's just telling us how far away from the origin of our Tycoon, or we can just say how far away from the Tycoon is the item. Okay, and that's going to be in object space. So it's going to be very simple, like 10 by 1, 10 by 0 by 2, which would mean it's 10 studs away on the x-axis and 2 studs away on the z-axis. Okay, and then what we're going to do is, using that, we want to now convert this back to world space, because we need to put our item somewhere in the world, and we can convert this relative C-frame back to world space, because we always have to set our C-frames in world space. So world space is the opposite of relative space, right? Because it's now relative to the origin of the world, 0, 0, 0. So we have to convert it back. So we can say Tycoon, well, local world CF equals Tycoon.primaryPart.C-frame : to world space. And we're going to put our relative C-frame in there, which is now, and this should be the player's Tycoon, which is lowercase, my bad. So we're getting their Tycoon, and we're getting the C-frame in the world for this specific position. And we can then pivot the item to that world space, put it into the Tycoon items folder, and then return true to say that the item was successfully unlocked. And then what we'll do is, down here in our button touched function, we can just say local success equals unlock item. We're going to pass the player, and we're also going to pass the item ID of the button. So we can say button : get attributes item ID, because don't forget we need the item ID as well in our unlock item function. So this success is either going to be true or false, right? Depending on how the function, what happens in the function, whether we've got enough money or not. So we can say if not success, then return end, because we don't want to hide the button if it wasn't a success. So we now should have a working button system. Let's go and check it out. And again, don't forget, every time you make a change to your Tycoon, make sure that you right-click, copy, and replace the Tycoon that's in the replicated storage. In fact, before we do that, let's just remove all of the items from the Tycoon when the game begins, so that we can actually see the items appearing when you press the button. We're going to need to clear out all of the items in the Tycoon first, because obviously when you start the Tycoon, you're supposed to have no items. So let's create a comment to say we're going to clear out all items from Tycoons, and we'll say for underscore comma, Tycoon in collection service. Now, I know we haven't done this yet, but we're about to do it. Colon get tagged Tycoon. We're going to tag every single Tycoon like we did with the buttons so that we can just easily get them all. And then if Tycoon colon is descendant of replicated storage, then continue end, because obviously we don't want to destroy the Tycoon that's in replicated storage because that's our placeholder Tycoon. So continue, we'll just move on to the next one without doing anything. But if it is a Tycoon in the workspace that we do want to clear up, we will say Tycoon.items. We're getting this folder which is within our Tycoon here, Tycoon.items. We're going to just clear out everything in here by saying colon clear all children, and that will just wipe it clean so that when the game starts up, this code's going to run and every Tycoon that's in the workspace that isn't the one in the replicated storage is going to have its items folder cleaned out. So if we click on run for a sec, you'll see that when the game begins, well, actually we need to tag it, don't we? So let's select our Tycoon in the workspace, head to the plugins tab again, open up our tag window, and if we just head over here to the right, let's add a new tag, Tycoon. Let's make sure it's selected and checked, and make sure you do that for every other Tycoon if you've got one in your folder up here. But again, don't tag the one in the replicated storage. The one in the replicated storage should be untagged. So let's head back, let's click on home, and let's go to the run button, and let's see what happens here. So I've clicked on run, and you can see the conveyor has disappeared because we just wrote some code to strip out all of the items. Let's rejoin the game here, and let's see what happens when I step on the button. Okay, nothing seems to be happening. Let's go to the output window. It says we've got an error. That's all good. So the error is on line 59 of the script. Line 59, which is where we get the item. Attempt to index nil with clone. So it's saying that this part, whatever's returned from this function, is currently nil. Now, let's just have a look at our get item function. That looks all good. I think what the problem is here is that nothing is being returned from here. So I'm going to take you through how I would usually debug a problem like this. So if we just go back here to where we're saying unlock item, obviously this item ID it must be nil. Okay, so we've passed it to this function called unlock item. So if we head down here to where we say button get attribute item ID. So I think the problem is that we haven't supplied an attribute for item ID to the button. That's my bad. So what we need to do is we need to, for every single button, we need to have an ID, an item ID attribute. So let's create an attribute and we'll call it item ID. Item ID. Let me just zoom in for you here. There you go, item ID. And let's set this to whatever the ID of the conveyor is. So the conveyor corresponds to this button and it has an ID of 1. So we're going to go and select our button for this conveyor and set the ID to the ID of the conveyor, which is 1. And now that should work. So for every button, you need to set its item ID attribute to be the ID of the item that you want to unlock. Okay, otherwise you're going to get errors like that. But if you do get an error, don't worry. It's just something that every coder has to go through. It's just a matter of problem solving, and your problem solving skills will get better the more you do this. It's all about understanding what's going on. So let's try this again. Okay, we've got another error, this time on a different line. So script 43, let's head back onto line 43. Attempt to index nil with C-frame. So this looks like it is going to be here, because in the placeholder Tycoon, I don't think we set a primary part, which again is my bad. So let's just go into the Explorer here and just right click and delete this Tycoon from the replicated storage, because we're going to make some changes to the one in the workspace. All we're going to do is we're going to click on our Tycoon here, and in the properties we're going to select primary part. Now this is very important. You don't want to click anywhere else for now. You want to make sure you've got this cursor which has the part with the red and black arrow on it. And then we're going to set a primary part, which is going to be like a point of reference for our Tycoon. So I'm going to go and set it in the decorations folder. I'm going to set it as this base part down here, okay? So what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to use the select tool. I'm going to hold down Alt, and I'm going to select the base down here, the base part of our Tycoon. Can you see it? There, so it's the floor. I'm just going to set the name of this down here in the properties window to be base. And then in the Explorer, I'm going to go back to my Tycoon. I'm going to then go back to the properties and set the primary part to be the base. Okay, so I've now set the primary part. This is just a point of reference so that we can, when we set our relative C-frames, it's going to be relative to our base because the base is the primary part. So let's go back in again. I do apologize for a few of these mistakes. Obviously, I'm working from a place that I've already created and I'm just rewriting the code out, so I may skip one or two steps. But okay, looks like we have another problem. Oh yeah, I forgot to copy the Tycoon, didn't I? So take your Tycoon now, right click, copy, and then we're going to put it back into the replicated storage. Okay, otherwise you'll get one of these infinite yield possible errors. So I'm keeping these errors and warnings in. I'm not skipping them over in the tutorial because you're obviously going to have some as well, and it can be helpful to watch me debug them rather than me hiding them. But there we go. I step on the button and it's generated my conveyor for me. So there we go. I think the last thing we're going to do here is just take our button, and in this for loop we're going to say button.billboard.gui, and we're going to say .text label .text equals, and then we're going to say the name of the item that we're going to unlock, and we need to get that somehow. So let's have a look at our functions here. We can use the get item function. So get item button get attribute item ID. We can say .name, and then we can concatenate this with 2 dots and a string with a hyphen, and then another 2 dots, and we can say button get attribute. Actually, we'll say let me think for a second here. We're going to say in fact, let's create a variable for the item. Local item equals. In fact, we'll create an item ID variable. We'll then create an item variable for get item ID, and then we can change the text to be item.name, and we can say item get attribute cost like this. Okay, so this is going to format the button's text to say item's name hyphen and then the cost as well. And we just use these 2 dots to separate the strings and the and these other strings here. So if we now click on play, we should see that it says conveyor 50. Okay, and you can add a $sign as well to the string if you want. That's no problem. And you can also see up here in the top right that our money has gone down from 500 to 450. Now, other thing that we need to do finally is we need to clear up the Tycoon when you leave the game, because we want to let another player take your Tycoon. So we can do this very simply by saying game.players.player removing :connect function player. And inside of here, we want to get the player's Tycoon. So local Tycoon equals get Tycoon player. And we can clear out their items folder by saying Tycoon.items : clear all children. That will just reset the Tycoon. And we also want to make the buttons visible again. So for underscore comma button in Tycoon.buttons : get children, do button.transparency is 0, which will make it visible again, and button.billboard.gui.enabled equals true. That will just set the text above the button to be visible again, and that should be everything. Now, we haven't done saving cash or items in the Tycoon. However, a lot of Tycoons are like this, they don't save anyway. However, I will probably make another video soon on how to make your Tycoon save. This has been a basic tutorial on how to make a Tycoon. I'll also be making a full course on how to make a full Tycoon in the future. And let me just show you how to add more items if you're a little bit confused. So let's go and add another model here from free models. So let's just do, let's just insert something like let's see, like a sign. Okay, let's insert a sign. So I've inserted my sign, and the first thing that I need to do is I need to add 2 attributes, one for the cost and one for the ID. So we'll do cost down here, set it to a number, and we also need, just like in the conveyor, we need an ID as well. So cost and ID, there we go. So this is going to be number 2 because it's the second one, comes after the conveyor. If you were to add another item, it'd be ID 3 or ID 4, ID 5. Just make sure that they're all unique and set the cost as well. So this could be 100. Now that I've got my sign attribute set up, I'm going to just in the Explorer, I'm going to drag it under the items folder, and then I'm going to right click, duplicate, and put the duplicate into the items folder in replicated storage. And lastly, I'm going to take the button over here. I'm going to right click and duplicate that as well. I'm going to use the move tool just to drag it over here. And then with my button selected, I'm going to head to the properties window. I'm going to change the item ID from 1 to 2 because the sign is ID 2. ID 1 is for the conveyor, and we want this button to be for the sign. And then that should be good to go. So let's just close the toolbox and let's go into the game. And you can see it now says sign for 100 and conveyor for 50. So I'm going to buy my conveyor. Now watch my money over here as I step on it. Let me just see if I can position the camera. Don't think I can, unfortunately. Okay, I'm going to step on it anyway. And you can see it's gone down to 450. And I've now got my conveyor. And aha, we have another problem. I've stepped on my sign and it's saying attempt to index nil with get pivot. That's because in line 43, it's this item variable is nil, which means that this function get item in Tycoon by ID has returned nil. So this means that the item must not be in the placeholder Tycoon. So also what you need to do is every time you make a change to your Tycoon, you need to take the entire Tycoon, right click, copy, and then replace the one in replicated storage with this new one. And if you have any other Tycoons in the map, you'll also need to do the same thing. So you need to make sure they're all the same version. But now we can have all sorts of different Tycoons rotated in all sorts of different ways, and they will all work. You will just be assigned one when you join the game. We'll just have to work out which one we've been assigned. We'll be able to figure out because, okay, it's this one. But you can see I can purchase my sign, purchase my conveyor, and hopefully I can't, yeah, we go. I can't purchase anyone else's stuff because this isn't our Tycoon. So there you go. That's how to create a Tycoon in Roblox. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. Don't forget to subscribe. And again, check out the full courses which will be coming soon. Link to that will be in the description down below. So I'll see you in the next one.